Right, let's crack on with our first story. The Scottish Government's new Hate Crime and Public Order Act has come into effect and it's caused a huge stir in its first 24 hours, Naila.
So the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that people should not be criminalised for stating simple facts on biology, as he backed J.K. Rowling in her criticism of new Scottish hate crime laws. Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has insisted the law will empower victims of hatred whilst maintaining public freedom of expression. So are the SNP successfully tackling prejudice here? Are they protecting enough people with certain characteristics? I think this is a potentially tyrannical piece of legislation. Let's discuss it now with LGBTQ activist Peter Tatchell and women's rights activist Eva Comrie. Good morning to you both. Peter, just explain to us why this is a good piece. Is it a good piece of legislation, in fact, in your opinion?
Well, the aim of the legislation is to protect people against hate. And that is a good thing, because hate can be very damaging to people, both psychologically, emotionally, and, of course, physically. We have to be clear, though, that this legislation merely extends the race hate laws to other protected characteristics, like the hatred based on religion, disability, age, sexuality, and so on. What it doesn't do is extend it to women who are victims of hate or travelling communities who are also victims of hate. So I think on that score, the legislation falls short. I don't understand why the Scottish Government hasn't, in particular, included women within this legislation. Now, it says that it will extend protection to women under a new misogyny bill, but that has been a long time coming, and I would urge the Scottish Government to speed up the legislation of that misogyny bill, and also just question, why should women be excluded from a comprehensive hate crime law and protected in a separate law? Separate is not equal. Women should have been included in that legislation that came into force yesterday. And of course, there should be the new, wider, broader misogyny bill as well.
Eva, woman to woman, I don't feel like I necessarily want to be included on this bill. I can choose to be offended if somebody says some mean words to me, or I can choose not to be offended, can't I?
Well, the difficulty that we have here with this legislation is that although Peter's absolutely correct in saying that we have to protect everybody, but particularly minorities, against hate, there is no evidence in Scotland that hate crime is on the rise. In fact, contrary to what our First Minister, Humza Yousaf, said yesterday, the latest hate crime figures for Scotland show generally a decrease. So one would question whether there's any need for this legislation at all. If there is a need for this legislation, then women certainly should be protected, because at the moment, under this new law, men who choose to cross-dress are protected, women are not. And that really is a pretty awful set of circumstances, especially when we were promised a law against misogyny, which thus far remains in the ether.
May I suggest to both of you that this point about protecting women's rights is a bit of a red herring? What does hate mean? It's such a flimsy, vague word these days. I mean, what is hatred, Peter? What are you talking about?
Well, that is one of the other flaws in the legislation. Key words, key concepts like hate, prejudice, malice, and ill will, all of which are words in the legislation, they are not defined. So they're open to different interpretations by different people. Now, it does say that this will depend on the interpretation by a reasonable person. But even reasonable people have different ideas about what constitutes hate. Now,
well,
there are some free speech protections. It does say that the legislation will not prohibit discussion or criticism of issues, and it also includes the right to shock, disturb, or offend. So those are some safeguards. And that's good, that's progress. But again, it's all down to interpretation. And we know from other legislation, like the Public Order Act, with its clause about harassment, alarm and distress, that those are often interpreted very differently by different police officers, different Crown Prosecution Service staff, and by different judges. So it does leave a bit of a question mark about how exactly this law will be enforced. But I want to emphasize that plan to cut down on hate is a good thing.
But what is hate? You're saying it again. What do you mean, hate? It means so many different things to different people. This word, hate, is deliberately vague because it's going to be used in a way to silence free speech. That's what opponents of this legislation are saying. What does hate mean? You said it again, but what does it mean?
Well, I just explained to you that
you didn't really. I mean, if I say to you, Peter, Man United are rubbish, are you going to? Is that hateful? Can you report me to the Scottish Police for that?
No, because the legislation says that it will not be an offence to make criticism, to discuss an issue, or to shock.
So if I say trans women are men, is that hateful?
No, that's an opinion, and that is protected under the legislation.
It's this idea of stirring up hate, Eva, isn't it, that is concerning, because if somebody would deem what Ben's just said to not just be hateful but to be encouraging, to be stirring up hatred, that is so subjective. And it isn't going to stop people having hateful thoughts. I quite like to know who hates who, and I quite like people to feel free to express who they hate, and then I know what I'm dealing with.
Well, we know that a lot of women, particularly in public life, are subjected to horrendous organised hate campaigns, particularly on social media, vile, hateful things. I mean, using words I can't use on this programme.
Sure.
Those kinds of that kind of harassment, that kind of sustained harassment against women, using vituperative and sensationalist and really vicious language over a sustained period, that to me would constitute hate.
But Eva,
it goes beyond mere criticism or discussion of an issue.
Eva, comment on that. Hang on, Peter. I just want to hear from Eva. Peter, Eva Conry, just comment on that if you would.
Well, the legislation refers to conduct that is threatening or abusive or insulting, so that a person is able to claim that they have been insulted. And unfortunately, the legislation enables anonymous reports to be made and for people to have non-hate crime incidents recorded against them without their knowledge or consent. I think you'll be aware that that has already happened to the MSP Murdo Fraser. So I, as a woman who supports Scottish independence, find it quite distasteful that unfortunately I'm on the same side as Murdo Fraser, one of Scotland's most famous or infamous unionist MSPs. So there are innumerable difficulties thrown up by this legislation, not the least of which is that women simply are not only not protected, women are now hugely concerned about vexatious complaints, such as complaints for simply saying that trans women are in fact male. So a colleague of mine, Sally Hughes, yesterday went to the police office in Perth, where she used to work. She's a retired cop, and she posed some questions asking for advice and guidance in respect of what sentences we were now able to use and which had now become banned. The police officer who dealt with her explained that Police Scotland are in the course of hiring hate crime advisors. Now, that's news to us. We don't know from where these hate crime advisors are coming. Are they internal appointments? Are they new jobs to be created? Despite the fact that the police in Scotland claim that they're underfunded, they don't have enough officers to deal with current substantive crimes, let alone deal with hate crime. Now, I'm not suggesting that we minimise the issue of hate crime. What I think we should say is put it in context. In the year 2022 to 2023, throughout Scotland, there were less than 6,000 reports of hate crime. Now, those reports don't necessarily lead to convictions, but the population is 5.5 million. Hate crime is not the worst or most awful type of crime on the political agenda in Scotland today, but it's the one that is attracting attention. And I wonder why that is, when, as I've said earlier, the figures are actually slightly improving.
Okay.
Yet to hear some Scottish politicians speak, you'd think we were living in a hate-filled, hate-fueled country, when we're quite the opposite.
Thank you both so much. LGBTQ activist Peter Tatchell and women's rights activist Eva Conry.